Welcome back to Under Baobab Skies. There is a place where the air forgets how to be wet, where the earth's skin cracks open into silent, thirsty mouths, where the clouds drift high and pale like distant, indifferent memories. This is the Congo Basin in the long Drea world, holding its breath, waiting for a memory to be sung back into being. For here, rain was never begged for. It was not a thing to be demanded from angry gods or bartered for with desperate sacrifice. No, here the elders knew a deeper truth. Rain was a guest, a beloved, wandering guest who had forgotten the way home. And to call it back, you did not shout, you did not weep. You sang the song it remembered. Let us settle into this night, where the fire is low and the stars are vast. The air is still, carrying the scent of dry loam and waiting. In this stillness, we journey not to a date in a history book, but to a feeling in time. A time when the priests of the water were not mere weather workers, but conductors of a cosmic conversation. They listened to the language of the wind, not its force, but its direction, a soft whisper hinting at which cloud tribe traveled above. They studied the color of the sky at dusk, not just its beauty, but its hue. A palette that told if the clouds were heavy with promise or light with forgetting. This was a science of attention, a liturgy of observation. Before a single note was hummed, before a single gourd was lifted, the land itself was consulted. The crack in the riverbed spoke of depth. The wilt of the cassava leaf spoke of duration. The behavior of the ants and the birds wrote prophecies in the dust. The drought council would gather, not in a grand hall, but under the oldest, widest tree. Their debate was not one of opinion, but of interpretation. Were they facing a youthful stubbornness in the weather, requiring the gentle, coaxing young rain song? Or was this a deeper sleep, an ancestral forgetting that demanded the older, more potent vibrations of the storm chant of the forefathers? The choice carried the weight of life itself. To choose wrong was not to fail, but to misunderstand, to offend, to invite either a meek, fleeting drizzle that mocked the thirst, or a torrent that did not know when to stop. The relationship was sacred, reciprocal, delicate as the first thread of a spider's web beaded with morning dew. The priests were the bridge. Their instruments, gourds, water drums, iron shakers were not tools of command, but vessels of mimicry. They held the echo of the rain's own voice, reminding the clouds of their true sound, their true purpose. Let's pause for a moment. The fire crackles gently as the night breathes around us. Listen to that silence. It is the same silence that once held the space between notes, the space where the rain's answer was awaited. Tonight, we follow the thread of one such song. From the tense, dusty council of elders to the crafting of the instruments that held the storm's echo. We will witness a day of too much success, where joy turned to teaching and abundance to loss. And finally, we will sit in a quiet, lamplit room in a different age, where an old voice sings into a brass horn, trying to place a living spirit into a waxened tomb. This is the story of connection and loss, of memory and machine. This is the story of the song that woke the rain and the silence that followed. Join us on this journey. Subscribe to Under Baobab Skies, and together, let's listen to the stories the dust remembers. Thank you for being here. Welcome, seekers of wisdom. Today, we journey to the heart of the Congo, where the earth is cracked and thirsty, and the sky holds its breath. Here, the Bakongo water priests don't just pray for rain, they read the subtle language of the land and sky to understand its deepest needs. By the end of our time together, you'll understand how these priests interpret signs in the wind and the light, choosing between a melody of gentle invitation and one of powerful ancestral remembrance. Imagine this: a council has gathered in the deep, protective shade of the Ensander tree, its roots like great, grey serpents burrowing into the hard, unforgiving earth. No chairs were brought for this gathering. The elders sit directly on the ground, connecting themselves to the land, feeling the very thirst of the soil press up through their bones. This is their first act of listening. Mafumu Nontolo, the eldest, his face a living map of dry riverbeds, closes his eyes. He isn't sleeping. He is tasting the air. After a long silence, he speaks, his voice a low rustle, like dry leaves skittering across the ground. The wind from the east, he says, it carries no salt from the great water. It is a wind that has forgotten the ocean. A forgetful wind needs a reminding song. His words hang in the still, hot air. A wind that has forgotten its source, the vast ocean, requires a song to help it remember its journey, its purpose. A younger priest, Kiala, watches the distant horizon. His eyes are trained not on the vast emptiness of the sky, but on the quality of the light where the sky meets the land. The clouds are not white, he observes, his voice steady. They are the color of ash, of cold hearths. He explains the difference. White clouds remember water. They are full of promise. Ash clouds, they are tired. They have carried their burden for too long and have set it down somewhere far from here, somewhere else. His words paint the dilemma facing the council. A forgetful wind, as Mafumu Nintontolo described, would suggest they need the Enkunga Ya Mvula Antonatha young rain song. This is a soft, repetitive melody that mimics the playful, persistent patter of a season's first showers. It's a coaxing, a gentle reminder sent up to a sky that has simply become distracted from its duties. It's a song of gentle persuasion. But ash-colored clouds, as Kiala points out, speak of something much deeper. They suggest a profound exhaustion, a disconnect from the ancestral cycle of give and take, of life and renewal. For a spiritual malaise this deep, the young rain song might be too quiet, too gentle. For this, only the Enkunga Ya Enkulu Za Mvulatha ancestor storm chant would suffice. This is no gentle tune. The ancestor storm chant is ancient and powerful. It contains the booming rhythms of the great storms that first shaped the land. The cracking, resonant vibrations that split the sky open at the world's dawn. To sing it is a solemn and serious act, not without its risks. It isn't an invitation. It's a profound act of recall, a deep and resonant call asking the very founders of rain, the ancestral spirits themselves, to stir from their long sleep and remember their children below. Let's pause for a moment and absorb the gravity of this choice. As the elders sit in contemplation, a single dry leaf detaches from the great Ensander tree above them. It spirals slowly, silently, down through the thick air, landing without a sound in the very center of their circle. All eyes follow its descent, watching it settle on the parched earth. It's another sign, another word in the silent conversation. Mafumu Nintontolo reaches out a hand, not to touch the leaf, but to feel the space just above it, to sense the quality of the air itself. The air is thin here, he murmurs. It is hungry. It eats the sound. He holds his hand steady, feeling the imperceptible currents. The young song may be too light. It may vanish before it reaches the ears of the clouds. The very atmosphere is weak, starved of the moisture that gives it body and weight. A gentle song might simply dissipate, be consumed by the hungry air before it could ever reach its destination. Kiala nods slowly, understanding the elder's wisdom. He has been listening in his own way. He walked the fields at dawn, had placed his palm against the bark of the wilting fruit trees. The sap is slow, he confirms. It sleeps deep within the wood. To wake it, perhaps we need not a whisper, but a name. The name the first rain knew. His words resonate with the council. A whisper is for waking a light sleeper. To rouse someone from a deep, near-deathly slumber, you must call their name loudly and clearly. This debate is not an argument as we might know it. There are no raised voices, no points to be won. It is a collective tasting of the world's condition, a weaving together of individual perceptions to form a complete picture. Each elder brings a piece of the puzzle, a different sensory experience of the drought. Now, another elder, Mama Nsengo, who had spent the morning with the women at the nearly dry spring, speaks for the first time. Her voice is like the memory of water flowing over smooth stones, calm and clear. The water that remains, it is warm and silent. She describes how it sits in the deep pool, without life or movement. It does not sing over the rocks anymore. It is waiting for a companion, for the cold, loud water from the sky to join it. Her insight is crucial. The water below is waiting for its kin from above. This is a call for reunion, a call for family. It frames the drought not as a lack, but as a separation. And the ancestor chant, at its very heart, is a family song. It calls the scattered children of the storm, the rains and winds, back home to the land that misses them. It seeks to mend a broken family bond between the earth and the sky. The choice crystallizes in the quiet that follows Mama Nsengo's words. All the signs now intertwine, pointing to a single truth. The forgetful wind that carries no scent of the ocean. The tired, ash-colored clouds. The thin, sound-eating air. And a silent, waiting water in the spring. Together, they point not to a simple dryness, but to a broken link in the great chain of cosmic memory. The elders now understand this drought is not a mere accident of weather. It is a lapse in the conversation between the worlds. The young rain song is for a sky that is merely distracted, a sky that needs a gentle nudge. But this sky is in mourning. This sky has forgotten its connection to the earth. It requires the older, deeper medicine. And so, the council, without ever taking a formal vote, comes to a unified knowing. The silence itself confirms it. The shared understanding settles over them like a cloak. They will prepare the ancestor storm chant. They will call upon the oldest powers to remind the world of the sacred, life-giving cycle. They will sing the family name of the rain. Slowly, as one, the elders begin to rise. Their silhouettes appear tall and solemn against the hazy, ash-colored sky. The decision is made. The work is about to begin. The council's decision wasn't the end of discernment. It was only the beginning. The melody, chosen in the shade of a tree, now had to be confirmed by the testimony of the earth itself. Before a single instrument was touched, the priests became pilgrims, their feet treading the parched land. They walked, not with the hurried purpose of travelers, but with the slow, receptive pace of listeners. Mafumu Mentontolo led the way. His staff tapped the ground, not for support, but as a gentle probe, a way of asking the earth a question with each quiet touch. Their first stop was the riverbed door, what was left of it. The Nkaisi River, once a life-giving artery, was now a vast, winding road of baked mud, fractured into a million geometric tiles. The surface wasn't smooth. Each crack was a deep, jagged canyon in miniature, a testament to the profound thirst below. Kiala knelt down, the sun warm on his back. He ran his fingers along the edge of a fissure, a chasm wide enough to swallow his entire hand. "See," he said, his voice a reverent hush that seemed to be absorbed by the dry air around them. "It does not split shallowly. It reaches down, like roots, in reverse." He looked up at the others, his eyes reflecting the vast, empty sky. The thirst is not just on the surface, it has dug its bed deep into the world's heart. A shallow song will not reach it. It will simply vanish, unheard. They all understood. The melody they chose had to have depth, a resonance that could travel through these deep wounds in the earth and touch the very core of its suffering. From the skeletal remains of the river, they moved to the fields. Here, the cassava plants stood wilting, their broad leaves hanging like limp, green hands in a gesture of surrender. Mama Nsengo, her gaze filled with a farmer's wisdom, didn't look at the dying leaves. Instead, she knelt and gently dug at the base of a stem with her bare hands. The earth was fine powder for a hand's depth, loose and lifeless. Then her fingers met resistance. Beneath the dust was a hard, cohesive block of soil, baked solid by the relentless sun. "The plant is polite," she observed, her voice soft but clear. "It suffers first. It lets its children, the tubers, hidden below, drink deeper from what little moisture remains." She brushed the dust from her hands. "But even their thirst is growing. The earth has given all its drink. It has nothing left to offer." This was another language, the silent, selfless language of the plants. The sacrifice of the cassava spoke of a system nearing its total collapse. The land's generosity, its ability to nurture and provide, was completely exhausted. They paused for a moment, standing amidst the wilting crop. A hot, gentle breeze stirred the dust at their feet, creating tiny, dancing spirals of earth. These miniature dust devils lived for a fleeting second, a brief whirlwind of life, and then they were gone, settling back into the stillness. It was a stark reminder of how fragile and ephemeral life had become in this thirsty land. Every movement, every breath of wind seemed to emphasize the overwhelming emptiness. The most profound readings, however, came from the silent witnesses, the creatures of the land. Kiala, ever observant, suddenly pointed to the ground. A column of ants, a dark, living ribbon, was moving in a frantic, unbroken line. They weren't scattering to forage for food as they normally would. They were migrating, a mass exodus towards a distant, rocky outcrop shimmering in the heat haze. "They do not forage," Kiala said, his voice filled with a sense of discovery. "They migrate. They have heard a rumor of dampness in the stones that we cannot hear." Their tiny bodies carried a message of desperation and hope, a secret whispered among the smallest of beings. As they watched the ants, a sharp cry sliced through the thick, silent air. High above, a pair of hawks circled, but they weren't gliding on the lazy thermal spirals of a hunt. Their flight was different, wide, urgent arcs that spoke of anxiety. "They look for water from above," Mafumu Nitontolo interpreted, his eyes tracking their desperate flight, "because there is none below for their prey." The lizards, the mice, the snakes, all the small creatures the hawks depended on had either died of thirst or fled. The animal world was not suffering in passive silence. It was broadcasting the emergency in a universal language of movement and sound, a symphony of distress that the priests were learning to read note by note. Finally, their pilgrimage brought them to the confluence of echoes. This was a sacred place, a hollow where two smaller streams once met the great Nkisi River, their waters mingling in a playful dance. Now it was a bowl of profound silence. The ground was smooth here, polished by the memory of a current that no longer flowed. Mafumu Ntontolo stopped and turned to the others. He asked them to stand still, to close their eyes. "Listen," he urged, his voice barely a whisper. "Listen not with your ears, but with the skin of your spirits. What do you feel?" For a long moment there was only the sound of their own breathing. Then Kiala spoke, his voice trembling slightly with the intensity of the sensation. "I feel a pulling, an emptiness that pulls at the moisture in my own breath. It's like the land itself is trying to drink from me." Mama Nsengo nodded slowly, her eyes still closed, her face a mask of concentration. I hear the memory of sound, she said. The ghost of water laughing over stones. It is a sad ghost. It haunts this place. This sensory confirmation was the final seal. The cracks, the wilting plants, the migrating ants, the desperate hawks, and now this spiritual vacuumit all pointed to the same truth. The land was not just dry, it was actively drawing, creating a void of absence that pulled at the very essence of life. The ghost of past waters haunted it, a painful memory of what had been lost. This was the precise condition that the Ancestor Storm chant was composed to address. It was a melody designed not just to fill an emptiness, but to answer a pull. It wasn't meant to just make noise, but to replace a haunting memory with a living, vibrant presence. The long walk was complete. The land had spoken to them in its many voices, in cracks and wilt, in migration and in silence. Its message was unequivocal, and it agreed with the omens from the sky. The song had been chosen correctly. The diagnosis was confirmed. Now their task was clear. They had to build the voice with which to sing it. They had to gather the instruments, the drums, the rattles, and the people to create a sound powerful enough to answer the desperate call of the earth. Their journey was far from over, but now they walked with certainty, their purpose forged in the crucible of the dry and waiting land. As the priests returned from the sun-beaten fields to the cool shade of the compound, the theoretical choice they had made under the Ensander tree began to settle into a practical, heavy reality. It was one thing to decide to perform the Ancestor Storm chant. It was another thing entirely to actually unleash its ancient echoes into the waiting sky. Mafumu Nentontolo, the old priest, didn't immediately go to prepare the ritual instruments. Instead, he walked to his own hut towards the small, dark corner where memory lived not in words, but in objects. His hands, wrinkled with age and experience, reached for a bundle wrapped in antelope skin. It was tied with a cord of woven river reeds, now so old they were brittle to the touch. Sitting on his low stool, he carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside, there was no tool of great power, no sacred artifact. What lay there was a relic of failure. A small, broken gourd rattle, its handle snapped clean in two. It wasn't sacred. It was a lesson. While the other, younger priests busied themselves with the solemn excitement of preparation. Their hushed voices filled with anticipation, the old priest held this broken thing and let the past wash over him. In his mind's eye, he was a young man again. About Kiala's age, full of that sharp, unyielding certainty that comes from knowing all the theory but none of the true weight of the song. That drought, so many years ago, had been different from this one. The winds were brisk. The clouds, a high, hazy white, stretched thin across the sky. The council of elders, his own teachers, who were now ancestors themselves, had debated the signs. They concluded that the signs suggested a distracted sky, a sky that needed to be gently coaxed, not commanded. So, they had chosen the young rain song, a gentle and persuasive melody. But the young Nentontolo, brash and eager and certain he knew better, had felt in his bones that it was not enough. He believed a stronger call was needed. So, in secret, during the ceremony itself, he had altered his playing. On his water drum, he had struck not the soft, rolling rhythm of gathering raindrops that the chant required, but a deeper, more insistent pattern. It was a rhythm he had stolen, a fragment he had overheard from the elders as they secretly practiced the far more powerful storm chant. He thought he was helping. He thought he was adding strength to their collective voice. Let's pause for a moment here. The memory is as dry and precise as the broken gourd he holds in his hand. Outside his hut, a log in the communal fire pops. The sharp crack pulling him back from the depths of the past into the gathering dark of the present. The result of his arrogance all those years ago had been a confused, dissonant offering. The rain that eventually came was a feeble, patchy thing. It was enough to dampen the dust in the village square, but it never reached the thirsty fields. It was a rain of embarrassment. The sky had heard two conflicting calls: the community's gentle invitation and his solitary, arrogant demand. It had answered with a lukewarm, indecisive drizzle that did no one any good. The crops failed. The council knew what he had done. They always knew, but they did not chastise him publicly, because, in their tradition, failure was communal. The shame belonged to them all. But later, his teacher, old Mafumu Kinkulu, had come to him in private. He said nothing about the stolen rhythm. He simply took the gourd rattle that young Nentontolo had been using during the ceremony and placed it into his hands. Then, with a sudden, sharp twist of his own powerful wrist, he snapped the handle. The cracking sound was louder than thunder in the young man's soul. The song is one voice. Mafumu Kinkulu had said, his voice calm but as cold as deep water. It is the voice of the land, speaking through us. If you make it your own voice, you speak only to yourself. The clouds hear only the truth of the whole. He left the broken rattle on the ground and walked away, leaving Nentontolo alone with his broken pride. Nentontolo had kept it. For all these years, he had kept it. It was the anchor of his priesthood. Every single decision he made as a leader now had to pass through the filter of that terrible cracking sound. It was the sound of ego breaking. It was the sound of understanding that this sacred work was not about gaining personal power, but about achieving a state of separation. A priest had to become so clear, so empty, that the drought itself could sing its song of thirst through you. This was the weight he carried now, as he prepared to lead the very chant he had once misused. Choosing the ancestor storm chant was not a promotion to a position of greater power. It was the acceptance of an immense, terrifying responsibility. It required a purity of intention that he knew, from bitter experience, he had failed at once before. As he heard Kiala and the other young priests respectfully cleaning the great iron shakers, their soft clinks and scrapes carrying a youthful reverence, he felt not pride in his students, but a deep, protective dread for them. They were focused on the mechanics of the ritual, on the awesome grandeur of the chant, but he had to ensure they understood its spirit. It was not a song of conquest over the sky, but a profound and desperate plea of remembrance. The song was a key to a door that should not be flung open with arrogance, but unlocked with trembling hands and a humble heart. He took a deep breath, the lesson of the past renewed in his mind. He carefully wrapped the broken gourd again in its antelope skin. Its purpose served. He stood up, the weight in his chest no longer feeling like a burden, but like a baluster stabilizing force that would keep the ceremony steady and true. He walked out of his hut and joined the others. Kiala looked up from his work, his eyes bright with excitement and respect. The iron is clean, Tata. It sings even in our hands. Nentontolo placed his own hand on the cold, heavy metal of the shaker. It does, he said softly, his voice resonating with a quiet authority the young priests had never heard before. But remember, our hands do not make it sing. Our hands only ask it to remember its own song. And we must remember ours, to be humble before the memory we are about to wake. With his words, the preparation entered a new phase. It was no longer just a logistical task of cleaning and arranging instruments. It became a spiritual one. The weight of the decision, now tempered by the memory of past failure, settled over the entire compound like a second, invisible sky, and it was a good weight, a necessary weight. It was the gravity that would keep their souls from floating away on the powerful, dangerous currents of the song they were about to release. With the decision to call the rain settled deep in their bones, The work of building its voice began. It started not with a roar, but with a whisper. It began with the gourds. In the compound's work shelter, under a roof of woven palm, Mama Nsengo presided over this first, delicate act. The light was soft and diffuse, filtering through the thatch, illuminating the space where she worked. Gourds were not merely chosen from a pile. They were courted, understood. They had been harvested months before, during a specific phase of the moon. From a special vine that grew near a perennial Springer vine that had never forgotten the constant, life-giving touch of water. Now, she laid them out on a mat of soft, fresh banana leaves. There were a dozen gourds, each a different size, a different shape, a different character. Some were small and round, like clenched fists, holding their secrets tight. Others were long and slender, with narrow, elegant necks, almost like desert birds. Their shells, dried and hardened over time, were not a uniform brown, but a rich palette of the earth itself, speckled tans, muted greens, and pale, sun-bleached ochres. The textures were incredible. Some were smooth, others were wrinkled with the memory of their growth. Mama Nsengo ran her hands over them, her eyes closed, listening not with her ears, but with her fingertips. She was not feeling for smoothness or for flaws, but for resonance. She was searching for a latent hum, a tension in the shell waiting to be woken. A gourd destined to sing the sound of the first droplets had to have that potential already inside it, a quiet song of its own. This one, she murmured, her voice a low hum that seemed to match the gourds. She lifted a small, almost perfectly spherical gourd. It fit snugly in the palm of her hand. She held it to her ear and tapped it gently with a fingernail. A faint, high toke echoed from within its hollow shell. Her face softened with recognition. "This," she said, almost to herself, "this holds the sound of a single drop falling into a still, silent pool. A perfect, lonely sound." She set it aside with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Next, she chose a longer, bottle-shaped gourd. She shook it lightly. The dried seeds left inside rustled with a soft, watery hiss. It was a sound you could almost feel more than hear. "This is the sound of rain just beginning to touch a forest of leaves," she explained. "Not the sharp sound of the drops themselves, but the collective sigh they make as they arrive, waking the canopy from its dry slumber." The work was methodical, meditative, almost a ritual in itself. For the ancestor storm chant, she needed a specific sequence of sounds, a narrative told through percussion. The first gourds to be played had to mimic the initial, tentative exploration of rainbows, scattered, testing drops that dare to break a long, oppressive silence. These gourds, the ones chosen for the opening notes, were prepared with meticulous care. They were fitted with handles made of supple, twisted vine. Then they were filled, not with their own seeds, but with precise numbers of tiny, smooth pebbles gathered from the riverbed. The choice was deliberate. Seeds have a life sound, Mama Nsengo would say. They speak of growth and sun. But pebbles are mineral, cold. They hold the sound of the earth itself, receiving water. She would count them out, one by one, dropping them through a small hole at the top of the gourd. 10 pebbles for this one, 12 for another, each number calibrated to produce a specific tone. Kiala, young and focused, was tasked with the first tuning. He took a gourd Mama had selected and, using a small, sharp, all made from polished bone, began to drill a second, tiny hole opposite the first. This wasn't for filling, it was for breath. The droplet must have an echo, Mama Nsengo instructed, watching his hands, her gaze sharp and knowing. The sound must not be trapped inside. It must leave the gourd just as a droplet leaves the cloud freely. To join the world, Kiala drilled with infinite care, his brow furrowed in concentration. The fine dust from the gorge shell fell like pale sand onto the dark mat below. It was a slow, patient process. When he was finally done, he shook the gourd. The sound was transformed. Before, it was a blunt, contained rattle, but now, with air free to pass through the second hole, it was a crisp, clear shiko-shiko-shika, a sound uncannily like water ticking on hot stone. It was no longer just a rattle. It was alive. Let's just pause for a moment and imagine that. The sound of that first tuned gourd hanging in the dry, dusty air of the shelter. It's a tiny, perfect promise of wetness, a single note of hope in a symphony yet to be played. One by one, the droplet gourds were awakened. Each one was given its own character, its own voice in the choir. Some were tuned to be high and bright, representing the drops that fall on the broad, waxy surfaces of ensafu leaves, skittering off with a sharp tap. Some were tuned lower and softer, for the drops that sink into thick beds of moss, their impact absorbed and muffled. Each sound was a different part of the rain's arrival. Mama Nsengo then began to arrange them in a semicircle on a special woven mat, placing them in the exact order they would be played. This arrangement wasn't random. It told a story. It was the story of a rain's beginning. The performance would start with the solitary high toke from the first gourd she'd chosen, that single, perfect, lonely sound. Then 2 gourds would be played in an alternating pattern. Shikatok, shikatok, creating the rhythm of the first scattered hits on the dry ground. Then a third would join in, creating a random, hesitant patter, the sound of the rain still deciding if it will commit. The sequence built not in volume, but in complexity, mimicking the way a real rain gently convinces itself to fall, growing from a few drops into a conversation. This was the absolute foundation of the entire sonic architecture. If this first part, the sound of the gourds, was wrong, if it was too harsh, too rhythmic, or too eager, the rain would hear aggression, not a humble invitation. It might stay away, offended by their impatience. Or worse, it might come in a violent, startled rush, a flash flood that would destroy rather than nurture. The gourds were the greeting. They were the polite, gentle knock on the sky's immense door. As Mama Nsengo ran her hands over the final arrangement, a deep satisfaction settled on her features. She gestured for Kiala to gently shake a few of them in their designated sequence. A faint, rain-like whisper filled the shelter, a delicate and beautiful sound. She nodded slowly, a small smile touching her lips. "They remember," she said, her voice full of pride. "They remember the feeling of being full of water. Now they remember the sound of letting it go." The first voice of the storm was ready. It didn't shout or demand. It spoke in whispers, in hints, in the fragile, beautiful language of a new beginning. If the gourds were the hesitant whispers of the first rain, then the drums were its gathering heartbeat. These weren't the tall, talking drums used for sending messages across long distances, nor were they the fierce, booming war drums of celebration you might imagine. No, these were the Enjamazar Envelothorain drums. They lived in the darkest, coolest part of the priest's house, a special place where their skins were kept slightly damp even during the harshest dry season. This was important, so they would never, ever forget their true purpose. Kiala and 2 other younger priests brought them out into the shaded courtyard with a deep sense of reverence. You could see the care in their movements, the respect they held for these sacred objects. The drums themselves were wide and shallow, expertly carved from the trunks of the Muvla tree, the rain tree itself, a fitting origin. Their heads were made from the skin of the water antelope, stretched taut but not to the point of being brittle. There was a give to them, a living quality, but the real magic, the secret to their power, was what was held inside. Before the ceremony began, these drums would be carefully filled, not with stones or beads or any other object you might think of. They were filled with water, and the amount was absolutely critical. It wasn't measured in cups or ladles, but in mouthfuls, poured with great intention from a special ceremonial gourd. Mafumu Nentontalo, the elder priest, oversaw this crucial filling process. For the ancestors' storm chant to work, the ritual required a sequence of 3 drums, and each one had to hold a different depth of water. This wasn't just for show. Each depth created a unique voice, a different aspect of the coming storm. The first drum, known as Moina Muvula, or the Child Rain, received just enough water to cover the bottom, about a finger's depth. When this drum was struck, it was meant to produce a deep, resonant boom, but with a clear, liquid shimmer rippling through the sound. It was the echo of that first heavy drop of rain hitting the bottom of a deep, still pool. The second drum, called Kintuadi, which means the companion, was filled to a hand's breadth. Its sound was thicker, heavier. When struck, it created a wet thud that seemed to linger in the air, a sound that spoke of rain finding its rhythm, of many individual drops joining together to become one single voice, one single presence. Then there was the third and most solemn drum, Ankulu the Elder. This one received the most water, but never more than half full. There was a delicate balance to it. To fill it more would drown the voice of the skin, silencing it. But to fill it less would mean it wouldn't have the necessary weight, the gravity its sound required. This drum wasn't meant for constant, rhythmic beating. It was used for the punctuation marks of the storm, the moments of emphasis. Its sound was a low, rolling duum that felt like it came not from the drum itself, but from the very earth beneath their feet, a vibration that traveled up through your souls. It was the sound of the gathered downpour finally settling in, claiming the land, announcing its complete arrival. Kiala was given the immense honor of testing the first drum. He took the cushioned beater, its head carefully wrapped in soft, water-repellent raffia cloth. He lifted it, took a breath, and struck the center of Moina Mula just once. The sound that emerged was unlike anything you'd expect from a drum. It wasn't a dry crack or a simple thump. It was a bloom, a sound that seemed to open up and expand in the air. A deep tone was immediately followed by a sloshing, liquid afternote that faded out slowly, beautifully. The water inside had transformed the drum from a simple instrument into a living entity. It was no longer just hide and wood. It was a tiny, captured storm cloud, responding to a gentle touch of lightning. Let's just pause for a moment and imagine that. That first liquid bloom of sound hanging in the compound. It's a strange, beautiful, and powerful promise of abundance. You can imagine even the birds falling silent, listening to this new voice in their world. Now, with the drums filled and tested, the tuning of the interplay began. This was where the music of the storm was truly born. 2 priests would play the first 2 drums, Mona Mfula and Kintuadi, establishing the core rhythm of the gathering rain. Boom, thud, boom, boom, thud. It wasn't a martial rhythm, not a march. It was organic, purposefully irregular, just like the pulse of a real storm slowly growing in strength. The tempo started slow, matching the hesitant, scattered patter of the gourds that began the ceremony. Then, as the chant would progress, the rhythm would gradually deepen and quicken, but it would never race. A racing drum would suggest panic, a frantic summons, a plea born of desperation. This rhythm was different. It was confident, assured a sound of a certainty arriving, not a hope being begged for. The 2 priests sat opposite each other, their focus absolute, playing the first 2 water drums in a slow, interlocking rhythm. With each strike, you could see the water ripple on the drumheads, the sound and the motion becoming one. Mafumu Nentontolo listened, his eyes closed, his head tilted just slightly. He was listening for more than just the sound. He was listening for the spirit of the rain within it. He was listening for that perfect harmony between the human action and the natural voice. Slower on the thud, he might say, his voice soft but firm. Let the water settle after the strike. Let it speak. The priests would make the small adjustment, and immediately the rhythm would become even more fluid, even more like a natural process than a human performance. And that was the ultimate goal, to erase the human hand, to make it seem as if the rain itself was drumming on its own hidden skins deep within the earth, and these priests were merely the conduits for that primordial ancient music. The water-filled drums were the bridge in this great ceremony. They connected the tentative invitation of the gods to the full-throated arrival of the storm. They were the sound of the gathering, the deepening, the sound of a promise turning into an undeniable fact. The air itself would grow heavy with anticipation, thick with the music of water and wood and spirit, all calling the rain home. The gods had whispered the beginning of the story. The drums had pulsed out the gathering heartbeat of the community. But for the ancestor storm chant to be complete, one final voice was needed. This was not a voice that called from below, from the earth, but a voice that spoke from within the storm itself. It was the voice of the wind, the crackle of lightning, the electric tension that rips the sky apart. This was the domain of iron. Iron was not native to this land in the way clay or wood was. It was a guest, a powerful entity brought forth from the deep, fiery core of the world through the sacred, arduous work of the spectres. Because of this, the instruments made from it, the rain shakers, were objects of immense power and respect. They weren't left out with the gourds or the drums. They were kept wrapped in black cloth, housed in their own separate shrine, away from the gentler, organic elements of the ritual. Today, for the final preparations, they were to be unveiled. Mama Nsingo, her work with the gourds now finished, moved to perform the necessary purification. She dipped her hands into a bowl of cool water infused with lucula leaves, a sacred cooling herb. This act washed away any lingering warmth from the sun, any trace of the earthy touch of the gourds. Her hands now cleansed, she approached the iron shrine with reverence. The shakers were not instruments one simply picked up and played. They were potent artifacts. She carefully unwrapped the black cloth. Inside lay 3 sets of thin, flat iron plates. Each plate was about the size of a person's hand, pierced at one end and strung together on a loop of tough, cured sinew. The metal glinted with a dark, cold light, a stark contrast to the warm tones of the wood and gourds. Each of these 3 sets had its own unique voice, a character determined by the thickness and shape of its iron plates. The first set was called Empev, which means the wind. Its plates were long and slightly curved. When shaken, they produced a shimmering, sustained shushing sound, exactly like wind rushing through tall, dry grass on an open plateau. It was a sound of arrival, a harbinger of what was to come. The second set was Nenenge, the flash. Its plates were smaller, perfectly square. Their sound was a sharp, bright, metallic crackle. Chick-chick. It was the sound of distant lightning, the sonic signature of light breaking apart in the clouds, a visual phenomenon given audible form. And then there was the third set, the most powerful of all, Empungu, the thunder that... Its plates were thick, almost like short, flattened rods, and they weren't strung loosely to jingle against each other. They were bound tightly together, a dense cluster of potent iron. This set wasn't meant for creating a rhythm by shaking. It was designed for a single, fierce, upward jerk. The sound it produced was a deafening, crashing clang sha, that exploded in the air and then rippled outward in a cascade of metallic echoes. It was the perfect sonic image of a lightning strike hitting the earth nearby, the immediate, terrifying, and undeniable proclamation of the storm's arrival. Handling these iron shakers required a completely different kind of energy. While the gourds and drums responded to gentle, flowing, circular movements, the iron demanded sharp, clean, intentional gestures. It was a different language of motion. For this awesome responsibility, Kiala was chosen to wield the Mafumo Nentontolo. The elder priest stood before him, imparting the final instructions. His voice was low, heavy with the gravity of the lesson. "The iron holds the anger of the sky," he explained. "But we do not play anger. We play respect for that power. Your movement must be clean, precise. You must convey awe, not fear. Remember this, Kiala. You are not making the thunder. You are showing the sky that we remember what thunder is." It was a profound distinction, not an act of creation, but an act of remembrance and respect. The rehearsal that followed was stark and dramatic. The entire sequence of the chant was pieced together. As the rhythm of the water drums built to a specific, preordained peak, Mama Nsengo would lift the Mpev shakers, her hands creating the rising sound of the wind. Then, as the drum peak was reached, she would deftly switch to the Nenenj shakers, their sharp crackle cutting through the air like flashes of lightning. And then came the climax, at the very height of the ritual. The moment when the chant's ancient words called upon the names of the first storm ancestors, Kiala would step forward. He would raise the heavy mpungu set high above his head with both hands, his muscles taut with effort and concentration. Then he would bring it down in a short, violent jerk knot, striking anything, but letting the tightly bound iron pieces crash against each other in the open air. The first time he did it in rehearsal, the effect was immediate and stunning. The sound was so shocking, so purely elemental and otherworldly, that everyone froze. The drummers paused, their hands hovering over the water. The singers' mouths fell open. It wasn't a musical sound in any conventional sense. It was the sound of a fundamental force of nature, captured and released. It vibrated in your teeth, deep in your bones. And the silence it left behind was not empty. It was charged, heavy with expectation, as if the air itself was now holding its breath. And that was precisely the point. The iron shakers did not continue the melody of the chant. They interrupted it with a sudden, irrefutable truth. They were the stark reminder that the gentle, life-giving rain they were inviting was born from a violent, majestic, and terrifying process. The iron was the shadow contained within the gift, the acknowledgement of the storm's full power. Let's just pause here for a moment and consider that. After the crash of the iron, the ordinary world must seem thinner, less substantial, as if a veil between worlds has been momentarily torn. The air is different. The light is different. The ritual has fundamentally altered the state of the present moment. With the mastery of the iron, all the voices of the chant were now prepared. The whispering gourds represented the initial gathering of moisture. The pulsing water drums were the heartbeat of the growing storm cloud. And the shattering iron was the voice of the storm's raw power, its arrival. Each instrument was a layer in a deep, sonic sculpture of a storm. Alone, they produced interesting sounds, evocative textures, but together, performed in the precise, sacred sequence of the ancestor storm chant, they would become something more. They would become a prayer spoken not in words, but in the very shape and sound of a weather system. The instruments were now ready. Laid out in the compound, they formed a powerful arsenal of sound awaiting the ceremony, the gourds resting on their mat. The 3 water drums filled and waiting, the 3 sets of iron shakers lying ominously on their black cloth. They remembered their songs, their purpose embedded in their very form. Now, the final task remained. The priests and participants had to become worthy vessels for the ancient memory they were about to sing into the waiting, ash-colored sky. They had to be as ready as their instruments. The night of the ceremony arrived, not with a cool relief, but with a heavy, breathless stillness. The air itself seemed to pause, holding the dust of the day in suspension. The entire village gathered at the edge of the sacred grove. They weren't just spectators, they were participants in a collective breath, a shared hope. They were not there to watch magic. They were there to become part of a plea so large it required every single heart to hold a piece of it. Fires were lit, not for heat, but as terrestrial stars, small points of light mirroring the dry, indifferent ones in the sky above. The priests entered the central clearing. They moved with a slow, fluid grace that belied the tension crackling in the air. They weren't wearing bright, ornate regalia. Instead, they wore simple, undyed raffia skirts and wraps, the muted color of dust and shadow. Their bodies were dusted with a fine, white ash from last season's sacred fire. It was a symbol of memory, and also of becoming a blank slate, ready to receive. Mafumu Nantolo led the procession, his face a calm mask, but beneath it, we could sense the deep current of responsibility we had witnessed back in his hut. Kiala followed close behind, the weight of the Mpungu shakers in his hands, a tangible anchor, grounding him to his task. The ceremony began not with a sound, but with a silence so profound it had its own texture. It was the silence of 100 people listening, not to the world outside, but to the world within. They were aligning their individual hopes into a single, focused beam of intention. Mafumu Nentontolo raised his hands, palms facing up, but not towards the sky. He held them level with the earth, as if he were weighing the very dryness of the land itself. When his voice finally came, it wasn't the frail, rustling sound from the council meeting. It was a clear, carrying baritone that seemed to draw its strength directly from the dust at his feet. We called to the memory in the wind, he intoned. We called to the forgetting in the clouds. These weren't lyrics to a song. They were the opening statements of a sacred contract, a negotiation with the elements. The gourds were the first to answer. Mama Nsenjo, sitting cross-legged before her semicircle of instruments, began the sequence. Tok shika shika. The sound was tiny, fragile, almost pathetic against the vast, dry emptiness of the night. But it was perfect. It was the exact sonic signature of Hope's first, vulnerable stirring. It wasn't meant to be impressive. It was meant to be honest. This delicate patter, like the first few drops of rain on a parched leaf, was swallowed by the night. But it left a trace, a pattern of anticipation hanging on the listening air. As the gourd patter established its hesitant rhythm, the chant began. It wasn't a melody you could hum along to. It was a series of deep, resonant phrases in the old tongue. Phrases that felt less like words and more like pure vibrations. They spoke of the first cold kiss on the hot brow of the world, and of the paths walked by the rain when the land was young. The priests' voices wove together, low and unwavering, creating a verbal root system that reached deep down, searching for the water table of time itself. Then the drums joined in. The two younger priests took up the beaters. Boom, thud. The water drums spoke, and their voice was a game changer. The sound wasn't just something you heard, it was physical. It vibrated through the ground, traveling up through the sitting bones of every villager. That liquid shimmer contained within the boom was unmistakably the ghost of water, made present in sound. A soft murmur, a collective release of held breath, passed through the crowd. The hope, which moments before had been thin and nervous, began to thicken. It became palpable. It transformed into joy, And right here, the first subtle shift occurred. The drummers, feeling the rising energy of the crowd, the electric charge of that collective hope, allowed their tempo to increase, just by a fraction. The chanters, buoyed by the power of the drums, let their voices gain a fraction more volume, a touch more Mafumu Netantolo heard it. He felt the delicate balance of the ritual tipping from a gentle invitation towards something closer to a demand. He made a slight, downward gesture with his hand, a quiet signal to steady the pace, to hold the rhythm. But the momentum was like a raft caught in a current that was suddenly quickening. The joy was simply too sweet, the anticipation too acute, the gentle correction was lost in the swell of emotion. This was the moment of unbound hope. It was beautiful, and it was infectious. Tears began to stream down faces in the firelight, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of feeling the drought being answered. Even if only in sound, for now, the people began to sway. A low hummed harmony rose from the circle of villagers, the people adding their own voices to the priests. The ceremony was no longer just a ritual. It had become a celebration of a rain that had not yet fallen, but which everyone, deep in their hearts, could now feel was already on its way. They were standing on a fragile, glorious, and dangerous precipice. They were no longer knocking politely on the sky's door. They were beginning to lean against it with the full weight of their united, joyous longing. And in the realm of memory, where the ancestors of the storm slept, such a unified, forceful call was not just a request, it was a summons. A summons that could not be ignored. The air, once still, now seemed to vibrate with a new kind of tension, the tension of a string pulled taut, ready to release a powerful note that would echo across the heavens. The people, lost in their collective ecstasy, had no idea what they were about to unleash. They had called for rain, but their joy, their unified demand, was calling forth something much, much older and far more powerful than they could ever imagine. The sky was listening now, not with indifference, but with a gathering focus, a slow awakening that promised to change everything. The chant was building, a tower of sound and hope rising into the dark night. Then the Iron Shakers entered the circle. Mama Nsengo lifted the Mpev set, the sacred gourds filled with river stones. A soft, rushing sound filled the air. She, a wind voice that cut right through the booming drum rhythm, creating this chilling, thrilling counterpoint. It wasn't just a sound from the ground anymore. It was a sound that seemed to describe the sky itself. And then came the Nenenge, a sharp, crackling chick-chick, the sound of lightning. The crowd gasped, a single, sharp intake of breath, all at once. The entire atmosphere shifted. The still, heavy air began to stir. A real breeze, cool and sudden, swept through the sacred grove, making the bonfires dance and throwing wild shadows everywhere. It was the sign, the answer they had been praying for. A massive, jubilant cry went up from everyone gathered. The energy, which was already high, became feverish. The drummers, totally swept up in what felt like a miracle, abandoned the steady, gathering rhythm they had been holding. Their beats became faster, wilder, triumphant. Boom boom, thud thud boom. It was the rhythm of a heart pounding with victory, not the slow, patient rhythm of a plea. Mafumu Nentontolo, the high priest, tried to get them to slow down. His shouts were completely swallowed by the roar of the crowd and the now frantic chant. He could see young Kiala's eyes, wide with a mix of terror and pure ecstasy, gripping the heavy Mpangu shakers, just waiting for his signal. And then it happened. Right at the peak of this human-made storm of sound and emotion, Kiala stepped forward. The cue was wrong, it was way too early. He was supposed to come in at the solemn climax, not in a chaotic gap of frantic energy. But the momentum was unstoppable. He jerked the heavy iron rods upward with all his youthful strength. The sound that erupted was immense. Clung. S, ha, ah, 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 ah. It wasn't just heard. It was felt like a physical blow to the chest. It was the final, shattered key turning in the lock of the heavens. And the sky answered. It didn't answer with a distant rumble or a few warning drops of rain. It answered with a sudden, shocking, white-blue fork of lightning that tore the night wide open, directly above the grove. The silence that followed was absolute and lasted for just a microsecond, the kind of silence where you feel like the entire universe is holding its breath. Then came the thunder. It wasn't a growl. It was an instantaneous, world-splitting crack that seemed to originate inside the very skull of every single person present. And then, the rain. It didn't begin. It arrived. All at once. It was as if a vast, celestial bowl, positioned directly overhead, was simply appended. There was no gentle patter, no gradual build-up. It was a solid, roaring wall of water. 1 second, the air was dry and dusty. The next, it was a torrential, deafening cascade. The sacred fires died in an instant, with violent hisses and huge plumes of steam. People screamed, but the sound was completely swallowed by the deluge. They scrambled, not looking for cover, because there was none, but simply trying to stay on their feet. To breathe, as the cold, punishing water hammered their skin. It soaked through their clothes in seconds and turned the dusty ground into a slick, sliding sea of mud. Let's just pause here for a moment. Imagine that scene. In that first minute of the downpour, the collective joy curdled into pure, primal shock. The blessing they had begged for had turned into an assault. The rain didn't let up. It just kept pouring with a furious, unrelenting intensity. The priests and priestesses stood frozen, their sacred instruments completely forgotten. Mafumu Nintontolo looked up at the sky, the water streaming down his face like tears, washing the white ceremonial ash into grey streaks. He wasn't seeing a blessing. He was seeing the literal, physical manifestation of a plea that had been too loud, too desperate, too full of raw human want. They hadn't gently invited the rain. They had ripped it from its slumber, and now it was falling with the violence of something startled, something that had been robbed. Within minutes, the shallow grooves and paths in the grove became streams. Within an hour, those streams became roaring brown torrents, carving new paths through the sacred space, tearing at the roots of ancient trees, and swallowing the smaller instruments. The ceremony site was completely destroyed. Back in the village, the paths were now waterways. The thatched roofs of the huts, unprepared for such violence, began to leak and then sag under the weight of the water. The joyous celebration had become a desperate struggle just to get home, to protect the grain stores from the flooding, to herd terrified livestock to any patch of higher ground. The sky hadn't just opened, it had broken. As the first grey light of dawn broke through the continuing storm, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The sacred grove was a wasteland. It was a flooded, muddy landscape. The sacred drums and shakers were washed away, some probably miles downstream. Huge, ancient trees were leaning precariously, their roots exposed and weakened. The village below was shrouded in the relentless, heavy rain. What had they done? In their desperation, they had demanded a miracle with such force that they broke the very balance they sought to restore. The rhythm was the key. The slow, patient, gathering beat was meant to be a conversation with nature, a respectful request. But swept up in the emotion and the first sign of success, they had abandoned respect for triumph. They had turned their prayer into a demand. Kiala, in his youthful fervor, had released the final, thunderous sound too early. not at the peak of a controlled ritual, but in the middle of a chaotic frenzy. He hadn't just called the thunder, he had shattered the sky. The elders would later say that they hadn't performed a ritual. They had committed an act of arrogance. They had treated the sky not as a partner, but as a stubborn lock to be broken. And when it broke, it unleashed everything at once. The life-giving water became a destructive force. The blessing became a curse. This wasn't a punishment from the gods. It was a consequence. A brutal lesson in physics and faith. It was a reminder that some forces are not meant to be commanded, only negotiated with. You cannot shout at the sky and expect a gentle answer. The energy you put out is the energy you get back. They had put out frantic, desperate, demanding energy, and in return, the sky gave them a frantic, desperate, destructive downpour. The story of that night would be told for generations. It wouldn't be a story of failure, not entirely. It would be a cautionary tale. A story about the difference between faith and force, between patience and panic. It was a story about the night the village of Congo learned in the most terrifying way possible that when you ask for a miracle, you had better be prepared for the true scale of it, and you must always remember the rhythm of the heart, the rhythm of the earth, and the rhythm of the rain itself. They had wanted the storm to end the drought, and it did. But in their haste, they had summoned a storm that nearly ended everything else as well. The rain they had begged for was now their undoing. A powerful, humbling lesson falling from a broken sky. The rain did not stop the next day, or the next. For 8 days and 8 nights, it fell, a monotonous, pounding dirge against the thatched roofs and the very soul of the village. The initial shock of its arrival, once celebrated, gave way to a grinding, wet misery that soaked through everything. The Nkisi River, so recently a cracked and dusty bed, was now a raging, brown monster. It roared with a fury none had ever seen, bursting its banks and surging into the lower fields. The village, strategically built on a gentle slope for good drainage, suddenly became an island of mud. Its lower huts were inundated, the water creeping up the walls, cold and relentless. The harvest they had prayed for so desperately, the sorghum, the maize, the cassava stood in stagnant, drowning pools. The proud stalks bent under the weight of the water, and the roots began to rot in the oxygen-starved muck. The promise of abundance had turned into a swamp of despair. The lesson arrived not as some distant, philosophical idea, but as a cold, wet, hungry reality. It arrived in the sound of a child coughing in the night, a new, rattling wetness in their small chest that sent a shiver of fear through every parent. It arrived in the sight of the community granary, the storehouse of their future. Its foundation undermined by the relentless water, listing dangerously to one side, threatening to collapse and take their entire reserve with it. Then, on the third night, it arrived with a terrible, sucking sound. A mudslide, loosened by the downpour, swallowed old Mobo's hut. Villagers scrambled through the darkness and the slick mud, their cries swallowed by the storm. They pulled him out just in time, coated in liquid earth, shivering and shocked, but alive. Everything he owned, every keepsake from a long life, was gone, buried under a new hill of mud. The priests, once the revered conduits of divine favor, were not treated with reverence in these days. No one blamed them openly, the theology was too complex, the fear of the spirits too ingrained for that, but they were avoided. People's gazes would shift away when they approached. Their power was now seen not as a bridge to the heavens, but as a dangerous lever that had been pulled too hard, unleashing a force they could not control. Mafumu Nentontolo moved through the flooded village like a ghost. He barely spoke, his silence heavier than the endless rain. He was everywhere, shoring up a crumbling wall here, bailing water from a family's hut there. his old body moving with a grim determination. But in his eyes you could see the truth. He saw the fruits of his life's work, his lifetime of devotion, and it was not abundance, but ruin. The memory of the broken gourd rattle, that small, personal omen, was no longer just his own lesson. It had become a prophecy for the entire community, writ large in water and mud for all to see. Kiala was shattered. He searched for the elder, finally finding him near the main path, desperately trying to divert a newly formed stream that was eating away at the earth, threatening to cut the village in half. The young priest's face was gaunt, his eyes red from sleeplessness and sorrow. "It was me," he choked out, his voice cracking. Rainwater mixed with tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "The iron, I did it too soon. I felt the power, and I wanted it. I wanted more." Mafumu Nintontolo stopped his work, his hands caked in mud. He turned and looked at the young man, and there was no anger in his eyes, only a profound, weary sadness that seemed to reflect the entire village's suffering. "No, Kiala," he said, his voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain. The iron was the spark, but the fire was already lit. It was lit by all of us. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. It was lit by a hope that forgot respect, by a joy that forgot fear. The ceremony stopped being a request, Kiala. It became a command. And the sky does not take commands. It only answers echoes. We gave it the echo of a demand. This, he gestured slowly, his hand sweeping across the drowning world around them, the flooded fields, the half-submerged huts, the weeping sky. This is the echo of its answer. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine standing there in that relentless downpour. The sound of the rain is no longer just water falling from the sky. It's the sound of a lesson. A hard, unforgiving lesson, soaking not just into the land, but into the very soul of a people. A lesson about the fine line between asking and demanding, between reverence and arrogance. After 8 long days, the rain finally stopped. The floodwaters began to recede, not with a rush, but slowly, reluctantly, as if unwilling to release their grip. They left behind a world transformed, but not in a good way. It was not a clean, washed world. It was a scarred one. The fields where their hopes for the year had been planted were now coated in a thick, infertile layer of silt, a grey blanket of death. Fish from the overflown river lay rotting in what used to be people's vegetable gardens, the stench of decay hanging in the air. The paths that connected homes and lives were now deep, treacherous gullies. Even the sacred grove, the heart of their spiritual life, was a tangled mess of uprooted trees and debris. The community gathered not for a celebration, but for salvage. The work was slow, silent, and humbling. Men, women, and even older children worked side by side, clearing the muck, assessing the damage, their faces grim but resolute. There was a shared understanding that passed without words. They had survived, but they were changed. From this devastation, a new, harder wisdom was born. It wasn't found in a scroll or chanted by a priest. It was discussed in hushed tones around the precious, crackling fires, fueled by carefully salvaged dry wood. It was pieced together from shared experience and collective grief. The elders, including Mafumu Nintontolo, finally put this new wisdom into words for the generations to come. Moderation, they said, is not weakness, it is precision. It's knowing exactly how much to ask for and when to stop. Respect is not distance. It is understanding the boundary between a humble invitation and outright theft. And the most powerful song, the most effective prayer, is one that leaves room for silence. It leaves room for the sky, for the spirits, for the great unknown, to make its own choice. The ancestor storm chant was not hidden away or forbidden. It was not placed on a shelf to gather dust, but now it was wrapped in layers of cautionary tales. It was handled with a new reverence. The chant itself became a lesson, a story told to every new generation to remind the singers of the immense weight of the song they were singing, of the power they were invoking. The flood had washed away their crops, their homes, and their certainty. It had washed away the illusion that they could control the world around them. But from that mud, something new began to grow, something deeper, quieter, and far more resilient. A new kind of faith. It wasn't built on the certainty of getting what you want. It was built on a profound reverence for the process itself, for the delicate, powerful, and mysterious dance between humanity and the forces of nature. Generations passed. The Great Flood, once a terrifying reality, slowly receded into the currents of memory. It became a legend, then a morality tale, a story told to children around the fire. Its lessons woven into the very fabric of the community's identity. But the world was changing again, in ways far more profound and permanent than any drought or flood. New paths were being carved through the land, not by the patient hand of water, but by men in stiff, khaki clothing. These new lines were straight and merciless. New sounds filled the air, replacing the familiar symphony of the forest and river. The sharp chop of axes felling ancient trees, the distant, shuddering blast of quarrying that shook the earth, and the foreign cadence of new languages spoken with an unfamiliar rhythm. The world was being unmade and remade. Then, one particularly dry season, a different kind of visitor arrived. He didn't come on foot or by canoe. He came in a dusty motor car, a coughing, sputtering spectacle of metal and smoke that startled the birds and sent children scattering. The man himself was a European, thin and bespectacled, with a restless, collecting energy about him. Through a nervous translator, he explained he was an ethnography. He had a mission, he said, to preserve the dying traditions of the people before they vanished entirely into the maw of the modern age. He had heard whispers and rumors of the rain priests. And he had a machine, he explained with great earnestness. A marvelous machine that could capture their voices and hold them forever. Mafumu and Tontolo's grandson, Nsimba, was now the senior elder of the village. His back was bent, not with the weight of ceremonial gourds, but with the heavy, invisible burden of witnessing relentless change. He received the strange man, his weathered face an impassive mask, listening patiently to the proposal. The ethnography, a Mr. Foster, became animated as he spoke. He eagerly demonstrated his machine. From his motor car, he produced a wooden tripod and mounted a large, gleaming brass horn, upon it a phonograph. He placed a blank, black wax cylinder on its spindle and carefully adjusted the needle. Leaning into the horn, he spoke, his voice unnaturally loud. Testing, 1, 2, 3. He then cranked a handle, repositioned the needle, and the machine spoke back. His own voice, tinny and small but unmistakably his, issued from the brass horn. A collective gasp rippled through the villagers who had gathered to watch. Some laughed nervously, others took a step back in fear. It was a box that remembered speech. It was sorcery. Nsimba watched, his old eyes missing nothing. He saw the magic, yes, the undeniable wonder of it. But he also saw the mechanics. He saw how the horn was just a funnel, like one used for pouring palm wine, but for sound. He saw how it directed the voice to a tiny, sharp needle that scratched a winding path onto the soft wax. The path was a memory, stored on a black cylinder. To him, it looked like a trap, a beautiful, shiny, intricate trap designed to catch a voice and hold it prisoner. And you wish for me to sing the rain songs into this? Nsimba finally asked. His voice, though roughened by age, still held a deep, resonant quality that commanded attention. "Yes," Mr. Foster exclaimed, his face alight with scientific fervor. "For science, for history, so that your children's children and their children after them might hear the old ways and know how their ancestors lived." The request hung heavy in the hot, dry air, and Simba looked from the eager face of the ethnography to the gleaming brass horn, and then beyond to the silent, empty space where the sacred grove once stood. He knew a truth that Mr. Foster, in his khaki suit and his quest for knowledge, could never comprehend. He knew a truth that even the younger generation in his own village was beginning to forget. The old ways, as the European called them, were not just tunes. They were not just a collection of words and melodies. They were relationships forged over centuries between the people, the land, the sky, and the spirits. The old ways were the specific weight and feel of a sacred gourd in your hand at the precise moment of rising humidity before a storm. They were the collective, synchronized breath of an entire village, hoping in unison for a single drop of rain. They were the bitter taste of ceremonial ash on the tongue, a ritual of purification and focus. How could a simple scratch on a piece of wax possibly hold any of that? It was impossible. The true magic, the spirit of the ceremony, would never transfer. It would be like trying to capture the coolness of a shadow in a bottle. You could seal it tight, carry it away, but when you opened it later, all you would find is empty air. The essence would be gone. The scratch on the wax would be a corpse without a soul, a map of a river that had long since run dry. And yet, a feeling of duty stirred within him. It was not a duty to this strange man, nor to his science, whatever that was. It was a duty to the song itself. The song was a living memory, and memories, he knew, when the people who hold them are gone, need a place to rest, even if that place is a cold, silent, and imperfect one. He considered the future. Perhaps the tune alone, stripped of its spirit, divorced from its sacred context, might one day tell a fragment of the story. Perhaps a child, generations from now, in a world he could not even imagine, might hear this ghostly melody filtering out of some new machine. And perhaps, just perhaps, they might feel a strange, inexplicable longing in their heart, a yearning for a rain they had never known how to invite, a connection to a past they had never experienced. The song would be a seed without soil, a whisper without a voice, but it would still be a seed. It would be better than silence, better than complete forgetting. His decision settled in his heart, quiet and firm. He looked at Mr. Foster, whose eager, hopeful face was beginning to show signs of impatience. "I will do it," and Simba said. A wave of relief washed over the ethnography. "But not here," and Simba continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And not with the instruments. The instruments, they are sleeping now. They cannot be woken for this. I will give you only the voice, the memory of the voice." It was a compromise born of sadness and wisdom. He would give the man the shell, the empty vessel of the song. He would allow the sound to be trapped on the black wax, knowing full well that the true life within it, the spirit that had once called down the storms, had already fled. It was all he had left to give. They set up the machine in the shaded, quiet interior of Nsimba's hut. It was the only place he deemed private enough for such a profound violation of intimacy. The great brass horn, like the bloom of a giant metallic flower, was pointed directly towards him. Mr. Foster, the collector, fussed with the wax cylinder, his movements quick and eager. He was a man on the brink of a discovery, though what he was discovering was a world away from what Nsimba was losing. Besides the two of them, only the translator and a single, trusted elder were present. The air in the small hut was thick, not with the familiar scent of ceremonial anticipation, but with a strange, almost clinical solemnity. and Simba sat on his simple wooden stool. He didn't close his eyes to find the spirit of the rain, as he would have under an open sky. Instead, he looked straight at the horn, this deaf, unfeeling ear that would listen without ever understanding. He cleared his throat, not of phlegm, but of a lifetime of emotion. To sing the ancestor storm chant here, in this enclosed space, to this strange machine, felt like a kind of sacrilege. This was a song meant for the open sky, for the charged air before a storm, for the collective soul of his people gathered in desperate hope. To sing it alone, for a mere scratch on a wax cylinder, felt like composing a funeral dirge for the song itself. He began. But he did not start with the thunderous opening invocation of the great chant. He chose something else. He began with the young rain song, the gentler, coaxing melody used to beckon the first soft rains of the season. His voice, though weathered by age, was still strong. It filled the small hut, a rich, warm sound that seemed too large, too alive for the confined space. He sang the familiar phrases of gentle invitation, the musical description of first droplets kissing the parched earth, but his voice was flat. It carried the notes perfectly. The intervals were exact, yet it was hollow, empty. It was like a body without a breath, a perfectly carved statue with no soul. He felt as though he were performing an autopsy on a living tradition, meticulously describing its shape and form while knowing, deep down, that its heart had stopped beating. He was singing the notes, but he was not singing the rain. Mr. Forster listened, completely rapt. He nodded his head slowly, as if he could hear the ancient magic swirling round him. He heard a beautiful, exotic melody. That's all. He didn't hear the profound absence of the gourd rattle's sharp toke. He couldn't feel the missing, resonant pulse of the water drum that should have been its heartbeat. He was deaf to the silent, humming space where the village's collective hope should have resonated. And Simba watched the man's face, saw the look of deep satisfaction, and felt a wave of hollow sadness wash over him. The machine was capturing a ghost, a pale imitation, and the collector was absolutely delighted with the empty sheet. He had mistaken the shadow for the substance. Let's pause for a moment. In the space between Nsimba's verses, the only sound is the soft, mechanical whir of the turning wax cylinder. It's a sound the song was never meant to keep company with. The rhythm of the machine is constant, unyielding, completely alien to the organic, breathing pulse of the chant. It is the sound of a new world, a world of gears and science, overwriting the ancient world of spirit and song. The worry is a constant reminder of what is being done, of the cold transaction taking place. A living, breathing piece of cultural memory is being transcribed into a series of lifeless grooves, its context stripped away, its spiritual energy grounded. Then Nsimba took a deeper breath. He shifted on his stool. A decision flickered in his eyes. He would not let this man leave with only a lie. He would give him one piece of the truth, just one fragment, to carry away into his world of machines and archives. He began the Ancestor Storm chant, not the full, powerful version that could take hours and draw every ounce of a singer's strength. Not the version that told the whole story of the sky gods and the first people. He offered just a fragment, the core melodic phrase, the section that called the names of the ancestors who had sung this very song to save their own people from drought and flood. As he sang, his voice changed. It gained a fraction of its old power, a deep reverberation that spoke of both dread and majesty. For a brief, flickering second, he was no longer in the hut. He was out under the vast, charged sky, feeling the crushing weight of his community's survival on his shoulders, smelling the ozone in the air, feeling the fear of the coming flood even as he prayed for the rain. His voice cracked. It was not a crack of weakness, but of the immense strain of channeling that powerful, ancestral memory. And in that crack, In that moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, the magic, for a fleeting second, almost escaped. The air in the hut seemed to thicken, to grow heavy and electric. The elder who was witnessing the event later swore he felt a sudden chill, a prickling on his skin as if the temperature had dropped. It was the spirit of the song trying to break free. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. The brass horn absorbed the sound, its impassive opening swallowing the raw power. The needle scratched its unwavering, monotonous line onto the wax. The magic, having no sky to fill, no earth to soak into, no hearts to move, simply dissipated. It was like pouring living water into a sieve. The song continued, powerful and sad, the voice of a king holding court in a prison cell. And Simba sang to the end of the chosen fragment, and then let his voice fall silent. The worry of the cylinder was suddenly loud in the stillness. He had given the machine what it could take. He had withheld everything else. The body of the song was there, on the wax, but its soul remained safely and sorrowfully within him. Magnificent, Mr. Foster whispered, his voice full of awe as the cylinder spun to its end. He looked at the device with reverence. Absolutely priceless. And Simba looked at the man, at his triumphant face. He saw the gleam in the collector's eye. The man saw a captured artifact, a rare specimen for his collection. And Simba saw a coffin for a butterfly. He had sung the song of waking the rain, a song born of thirst and fear and hope, into a device that had never felt thirst, never tasted ash in a dry wind, never feared a devastating flood. The melody was preserved, yes, but the meaning, the true essence of the ancestor storm chant, was buried deep in the old man's heart, and in the forgotten mud of a field generations gone. The recording was a success, but the song was lost. The ethnography packed his precious cylinder into a padded box, thanked Nsimba profusely with words that felt like coins tossed into an empty well, and chugged away in his motor car. A deep quiet settled over the compound. It was quieter than the drought, quieter than the silence after the irons crash. It was the quiet of something completed and something ended. The dust from the car's tires, a plume of red earth, hung in the air for a long moment before slowly, almost reluctantly, settling back onto the ground. The hum of the engine faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast open land, until only the familiar sounds of the village remained: a distant goat bleating, the soft scrape of a pot, the rustle of dry leaves in the breeze. And Simba sat outside his hut on a low, worn stool as the evening came on. The sun, a fiery orange ball, dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and deep indigo. The dry season was waning. There was a hint, just a whisper, of dampness on the later breeze. It was a natural dampness, not one summoned by song or ritual. A rain that would come or not come on its own terms, no longer invoked. He felt the shift in the air on his skin, a change his ancestors had felt for generations. This feeling, this intimate knowledge of the world around him, was something the metal box could never capture. His grandson, a curious boy of 10 with bright, questioning eyes, came and sat beside him. The boy leaned his small frame against Nsimba's sturdy leg, a familiar comfort. For a while, they sat in shared silence, watching the first stars begin to prick the darkening canvas of the sky. The village was peaceful, winding down after the day's labor. "Grandfather," the boy finally asked, his voice small but clear in the quiet air, "will the box make it rain in the white man's country?" The question was innocent, born of the day's strange events, of seeing his grandfather, the revered rainbringer, sing his most sacred song into a lifeless metal horn. And Simba placed a gentle, wrinkled hand on the boy's head, his fingers tracing the familiar shape of his skull. "No, little one," he said, his voice as soft as the gathering dark. The box holds only the shadow of the song. A shadow is not the thing itself. He paused, searching for the right words. The song itself. The song needs thirsty earth to listen. It needs hands that know the weight of a dry gourd, the ache in the back from carrying water. It needs hearts that remember a flood, that know the fear and the respect the water commands. He looked up at the emerging stars, a glittering map of stories. They were the same stars that had watched his own grandfather choose a melody based on the color of the clouds, on the direction of the wind, on the way the insects sang in the twilight. The magic was in the doing, he continued, not just in the tune. We were not singing asterisk at asterisk the rain, you see. We were having a conversation with it. We were asking, pleading, reminding it of its bond with the land, with us. The box, it only hears the words. It does not understand the conversation. The boy was quiet, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to grasp the old man's meaning. He looked from his grandfather's face to the vast, silent sky. So the song is dead now, he whispered, a touch of fear in his voice. No, Nsimba said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. It was a smile of acceptance, not of defeat, not dead, sleeping. But it is a deep sleep. It sleeps in the story of the great flood that carved this valley. It sleeps in the way your mother still knows to listen to the wind before she plants the first seeds. It sleeps here, and he gently tapped the boy's chest, right over his heart. The tune in the box is like a drawing of a person. It shows you what they looked like. You can see their eyes, their hair, the shape of their smile. But it cannot laugh with you. It cannot hold your hand when you are scared. It is a memory, not a presence. This was the final understanding, the truth he had known intuitively when he first agreed to sing for the strange machine. Preservation is not continuation. You can preserve a seed in a block of resin, perfect and unchanging for 1,000 years, but it will never grow. It will never feel the sun or drink the rain. The living tradition of the rain song had been a growing vine, sensitive to the weather of its time, changing its leaves with the seasons, putting down new roots. Now it was being pressed flat between the pages of a book, recorded as a scratch on a piece of wax. It was safe, and it was over. A night bird called from a distant tree, a mournful three-note cry that has outlasted empires and will surely outlast machines. From inside the hut, the small fire popped and hissed, a comforting, domestic sound. And Nsimba felt no anger, no bitterness towards the man in the motorcar. He had come with a strange kind of respect, a desire to save what he saw as a dying art. But how can you save a conversation by only recording one side of it? Instead, Nsimba felt a profound, weary love. A love for his people, for his land, for the songs and the silence. He had done his duty. He had given the future a sketch, a clue. Perhaps, he thought, it was enough. Perhaps, someday, a listener in a distant land, a land of concrete and steel, hearing the thin, scratchy recording of an old man's voice singing in a language they did not know, would feel a sudden, inexplicable longing. A longing for a connection they could not name. A thirst for a rain they did not know how to call. And in that moment of longing, the faintest echo of the true magic might stir. It wouldn't be enough to wake the rain, not from that far away, not from a heart that didn't know the story. But it might be enough to remind someone, somewhere, that the sky was once a place you could talk to, and the rain was a guest you could invite home with a song. He stood, his old bones creaking in protest, and gently pulled his grandson to his feet. Come, it is time to go inside. He led the boy into the warm darkness of the hut. The wax cylinder was on its journey to a museum, to an archive, to a forgotten shelf in a dusty room. But the memory of the song, in its full, terrible, beautiful truth, was safe too. It was safe in the silence he now carried, in the lesson of the flood-scarred land. And now, it was safe in the heart of the boy beside him. A boy who would one day tell his own children the story of the day his grandfather sang to a metal flower, not to make it rain, but to remember how, inside the hut, Nsimba took a small, simple oil lamp. He struck a match, and the tiny flame blossomed, pushing back the darkness. The warm light illuminated his and his grandson's faces, casting long shadows that danced on the hut's earthen walls. It was a small, warm, human moment, a tiny fire against the vast night. A story passed from one heart to another, a promise that even in the deepest silence, something important would be remembered. The song was sleeping, but it was dreaming in the heart of a child. And that, Nsimba knew, was a kind of magic all its own. The fire is low now, just embers breathing a soft orange light. The vast bowl of the night sky above us holds no ash-colored clouds tonight. It holds only stars and a deep, quiet darkness. The story we have followed from the council's debate to the flood's lesson, from the cold iron to the cold wax, has settled into the stillness around us, like dust returning to earth after a long journey on the wind. We sat with elders who read drought in the color of the sky and the crack of the soil. We felt the weight of a choice that was not between good and bad, but between one kind of remembering and another. We heard the first fragile whispers of gourds, mimicking a hope so tender it could break. We felt the gathering heartbeat of drums filled with the very element they sought, a powerful, liquid prayer. We were shattered by the iron's truth, the reminder that gentleness is born from a force that can split the world. We witnessed joy tipping into excess, and the skies aren't an answer so complete it became a punishment. We learned from the mud and the loss that the most powerful invitation is one that leaves room for a no. And finally, we sat in a quiet hut, where the last singer gave a ghost of his song to a machine that could only capture its skeleton, preserving the echo while the voice flew away. So what remains, here in the stillness, after all the sound has faded? The rain still falls, of course. It falls according to patterns too large for our songs now. But sometimes, on a certain kind of quiet, thirsty evening, if you listen not with your ears, but with the memory in your bones, you might hear it. Not the roar of the flood, not the hiss of the recording, but the ghost of that first, perfect toke from a tuned gourd. It is the memory of a relationship. A time when humanity did not stand apart from the weather, trying to control or predict it, but stood in conversation with it. A time when a drought was not a disaster to be endured, but a silence in a dialogue to be gently repaired. Let's take a final, soft pause. The embers sigh. The night is cool. The baobab's great presence is a comfort, a witness to centuries of such stories, of such songs sung and such silences kept. The song to wake the rain is silent now, but its absence has its own wisdom. It teaches us to listen to the different kinds of rain, the rain that falls, the rain that is remembered, the rain that is longed for. It reminds us that some conversations are so sacred they can only be held in a specific language, under a specific sky, with a specific kind of listening heart. When those conditions fade, the conversation doesn't end. It changes form. It becomes a story, a lesson, a longing, a single, clear note held in the archives of the stars. You have sat through this long telling. You have held the thirst, the hope, the flood, the silence. You have carried it with you under these vast, watching skies. You are under baobab skies.